Hello friends, I'm Jeanette and you're visiting the Neals Homestead and this is my kitchen. October is upon us and that means that holiday cooking is just around the corner. A group of 3 ladies who have YouTube channels have joined in collaboration about making pies, and they want to center around old-fashioned kind of pies or any kind of pies that somebody can enjoy for making their holiday meals better. I was tagged by one of the ladies, Tammy from Little Jordan Farm, and she asked me if I'd be willing to make a pie, and I said yeah, that would be great. The pie I've chosen to make is an apple pie. First, I want to tell you that I think that the most important part of a pie is the crust. I know that not everybody will agree with that, but to me, if the crust is good, then you're not going to notice about the rest of it. If the crust is bad, then all you notice is that the crust isn't good. And so I have made several pies over my life, and I've always had good results with the pie crust recipe that I used, and so I'm going to show that to you today. And that's why we're all here. Thanks for joining me. There are 4 main components of a pie crust. You have your flour, your fat, salt is mixed with the flour, and then you add water. And there are 3 principles that I feel like are very important to making a good pie. One is that you use the proper ingredients, the proper flour, which it should be a low gluten flour. I like to use Pollyanna unbleached flour because I feel like the bleaching takes a little bit of the nutrition and the quality of the food away, so I like to buy unbleached flour. And Pollyanna is a low gluten. It's not a flour that you would make bread with, because when you make bread you need a high gluten flour, because it's what makes the bread stick together is the gluten. But you want your pie crust to be flaky and to kind of fall apart a little bit, and so you don't want that gluten activated in your pie crust to make it stick together. You want it to be flaky. And then it's important to have good fat. I prefer lard. It's an old-fashioned thing to do, but I think it's the best at making pie crust. You know, back whenever I was younger, everybody used shortening, and I'm sure still a lot of people do use shortening, but I came to believe that shortening is not good for you. Back then they said lard was not good for you, but I believe shortening is not good for you and lard is better for you. So I use lard, and I use lard that I made myself from a hog that I butchered, and I cooked the fat out of it and rendered the lard in a kettle out in my driveway, and I'll make a link to that video. Actually, it's 3 videos that I put together on rendering lard over an open fire, which was kind of a fun experience. And then water, of course. We use well water. It's just your average water. It doesn't have any chlorine. I don't know that chlorine makes any difference to a pie crust. And then of course the salt, and I'm using a red salt, pink salt I guess it is. But it's very important that in a pie crust that all of your ingredients be cold, because cold helps the fat and the flour to go together in a proper way. Now, I'm not positive of the science behind that, but I just know that it's the fact. So my lard has been refrigerated, it's cold, and with my water I actually put ice cubes in it, so it's extra cold. The flour and the salt are room temperature. And then there's an optional ingredient that I'm actually going to use this time. To tell you the truth, this is my first time to use this, but it's apple cider vinegar. And the principle behind that is that if there is any gluten action going on with your flour, that the cider stops that. It kind of inhibits the gluten from developing in your flour and helps you have a better flaky pie crust. And then the other thing that I want to point out to you is to work your dough as little as possible, because again, back to the gluten, when you start working that flour and the fat and the water, you're going to activate some gluten, which you don't want to do. So work your dough as little as possible to get it mixed up and get it rolled out. So let's get on to mixing it all together. My favorite cookbook is and always has been an old Betty Crocker cookbook. This is what I did a lot of my learning to cook from the time I was 18 years old on, and it has very many basic recipes in it that you don't find so much these days, where you do everything from scratch and start and explain more of how the process works and how to make it be a good end product. And the recipe I'm going to use from here calls for 2 2/3 cup of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 3/4 plus 2 tablespoons of lard, which I got a full cup and I'm just going to take like 2 tablespoons out. That's the best way to figure it for me. And then 7 to 8 tablespoons of water. The water can vary kind of depending on the weather and different things. So I just add water a little at a time until I have enough, but they give you an idea here of how much water it's going to take, or it could take. And then the ingredient that I'm not finding in this cookbook is the apple cider vinegar, and so I'll be adding 1 teaspoon of that. Begin by putting the flour and the salt into the bowl. Mix that up a little bit. I'll make a well in the middle and put in my lard. Now the interesting thing about lard is, with shortening you would use a whole cup of shortening, but with lard you use 2 tablespoons less. I think because it's just kind of has a greasier texture to it. It doesn't take as much to do the same job. And then we'll use a pastry blender. And what I'm going to do is cut the lard into the flour. Just kind of make little crumbly pieces of it. This takes a few minutes, and I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing, so I'll cut through that. When you've worked your flour and your lard together enough that it starts resembling cornmeal, I think you're done. And when you reach a point where it doesn't really stick to your pastry blender much, I think that's another sign that it's done. Now, around in this time when you're incorporating your water is when you would add in the 1 teaspoon of vinegar. Make another well inside the center of your crumbled up dough there, and add 1 tablespoon of cold water at a time and mix it around. When you feel like that's incorporated, then just keep going and add them one at a time. Right now I'm going to add in the vinegar. This is number 3. It's starting to clump up a little bit, but it's not there by any means. Now, the recipe called for 7 to 8 tablespoons of water, and I'll tell you, generally I put the least amount in, but today the least amount is not enough because it's clumping together, but I certainly can't make a ball out of that yet. So I'm going to go ahead and add another one and kind of put it around the edges where it seems like maybe some of it's not absorbing the water. Now, I generally try not to touch the dough at all, but since this doesn't really look like it's wanting to clump together, I'm going to just test it right there, and that is clumping. There's some loose and a little drier down on the bottom, so much as I don't really want to, I'm going to add a little bit more flour. thing is, you want as little water as possible in here to have a flaky crust, but you need enough water so that your dough will stick together and not fall apart. And to tell you the truth, if it falls apart, it actually makes a better crust if you ask me, but it is harder to work with and it's hard to make it look as nice. I think I'm going to call that good. I have this plastic thing that is designed to do a pie crust on or a pizza crust, and I think what I'll do, again, I'd like to not touch my dough as much as possible, but I feel like it needs to be incorporated a little bit more. So I'm going to knead it just a little bit. This is enough dough for a 2-crust pie, so I need to cut it in half. Then set half aside. I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on my surface. I don't want a lot, but I want just enough to keep the dough from sticking to the plastic. I'm also going to flour my rolling pin and sprinkle a little bit on top in the process. And I'll start rolling it out. Try to get it even. If it's too dry when you're doing this, it wants to crack along the edges. And that's kind of annoying. You have to try to fix it. A lot of years ago, my mom made me a 2-layer cloth pad, I guess, that you can roll out pie dough on. And I like using the cloth. That was good, but 9 years ago our house burned and I lost that, and so then I just have this plastic one. Someday I should make my own, I guess, or maybe I can make some for my daughters-in-law or my granddaughters. Dough is wanting to crack a little bit right there. You don't want to let it crack, because when you put it in the pie pan and it's cracked, it will let the juices ooze out there underneath the crust. That's not good. My pan I'm going to use is 9.5 inches. So this is, I've got a little gap right here and I've got a little gap right here, but I believe that what I'm going to do is try to fix that with the extras as I go along. The pan I'm using is a Pampered Chef pan. I think it's going to be good because it's really deep, and I like an apple pie to be really deep. So I'm carefully lifting that off of there and carefully placing it inside. I missed a little bit, but you got to be able to rearrange. And might not be that much patching that I need to do. But I think I might pinch a little bit off of here, and when you patch your pie crust, you can get it wet a little bit, and then that acts as glue, yeah, and so it helps it to stick there. Other than that, I think that's pretty good. I will set this aside, and then while I'm here at my table, I'm going to go ahead and roll out the top crust. I think that cooperated with me pretty good. Now, I'm going to set this aside also, just on this plastic thing, because I have to mix up my ingredients for the pie. I went to my local Amish bulk food store and I wanted to buy some local Missouri apples, and they had several different kinds. One of them was Jonathan. They had these Jonna Golds, which are the ones that I chose. And I can't remember the other two kind, but they said they all came from Waverly, which is north up by the Missouri River, maybe an hour and a half north of us. So I was happy to get some local apples. The way I'm going to peel and slice them is with this peeler and slicer. And I think these things are really handy. They take save a lot of time and trouble. This is a suction type peeler, and in order to make it stick with the suction, you have to make things a little bit damp. So I'm just wiping some water, a wet washcloth on there, and there, now it's good and stuck. Been having a little bit of trouble getting it stuck. When I get ready to peel the apples, I take the stem off too, because it often hangs up in this little place right here. So I poke my finger through this hole here, which is the coring mechanism, and that helps me to get it pushed on there centered. And then start twirling. This peels it right here. This mechanism right here slices it in a spiral. And you end up with that. Really fast and easy. And sometimes you have to trim off a little bit of peeling in that area. And the core slides off like that. Push a little lever right here and open it up again for your next apple. Use these apples in the pie. I will slice down one side, and then that makes them come out in individual slices. Well, I got my apples peeled and sliced, and I think maybe I peeled up more than I needed, but we might have to have some apples some other way, because I think that's going to be more than I can fit into my pie pan. And also I went ahead and cut the little circles in half again, so they're more of a slice, half a slice instead of the big rounds. Before I start mixing the ingredients for the pie, I'm setting my oven for 425. For the filling part of the pie, I need 1 cup of sugar, 1/3 of a cup of flour, and then a combination of 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of nutmeg, and a dash of salt. I'll stir that around just to mix it up a bit, and pour that over my apples. This just coats the apples really nicely, and as it cooks, the juice comes out of the apples and mixes with the flour, and that causes it to get thicker. So you don't have a runny pie. That's why you don't just put apples and sugar in there, because if you did that, you would just have a runny pie. You need the flour in there to make sort of an apple gravy, so to speak. Now we're ready to put the apples in the bottom pie crust. Just going to use my hands so I can make sure they get laid down in there nicely, because I've got a lot of apples and I want my pie to be really full of apples. Don't you just hate when you get a piece of pie and you get into it and there's hardly any fruit or any filling into the pie? Now that pie is not going to be short on filling, but I also need to be careful that I don't fill it up too much, because as it cooks there's a lot of liquid that accumulates and it will boil over. And for that reason we're going to do the next step. The next step involves putting about 3 tablespoons worth of butter in pats on top of your pie. Now the reason you do this is for what I just said, so that it doesn't boil over. When the liquids meet that butter on top, the greasiness of the butter, it stops it from boiling over. Plus, I love butter, and it makes it taste better, doesn't it? Now we're ready for that top crust that I set aside. I'm going to lay it right up on top of there. Okay. Now if the crust is really good, I like a lot of edge crust. If it's not very good, then everybody just throws it away and they don't want to eat it. So what I do is take my top crust and tuck it underneath the edge of the bottom crust. And that kind of seals it up a little bit. So you'll have less likelihood of it boiling over. But this method makes a pretty thick edge crust. But like I said, I'm okay with that if it's good. Right, I have it all tucked. The way that I finish the edges is pretty simple. And in fact, this pie plate has edges like that. I take 2 fingers and lay it down. There are little dips right here in the pie plate, and then I bring that finger back. And this creates a seal. It seals the edges together and keeps the inside goodies from boiling over. Now this is not the most beautiful and the most fancy way to do a pie, but if you know me for very long, I am not a fancy kind of person. I'm pretty plain and basic. I raised 3 sons. I didn't have to do any of the frills like hair and bows with my children. I have 5 brothers, so I'm kind of a tomboy. Also, for the reason of not having it boil over, you cut slits. And you can do whatever kind of design you want on here. You can do kind of a starburst where you make several slits going outward. What I typically do is make a long one down the center, 2 shorter ones on either side, and then an even shorter one on the sides of those. Now, whenever it heats up and the steam starts trying to escape, instead of pushing up the pie crust or boiling out over the sides, it'll just leak out of these slits that you've made. I have some cinnamon sugar in my cabinet that's already been mixed up, so what I'm going to do is just sprinkle that over. I know some people put egg white on their pie crust, I think it is, but I've never done that before. Might be a good thing to do. I should try it sometime. But that'll make it be nice and brown and crispy. Now this pie has to bake in a hot oven for 40 to 50 minutes, and if you just put your pie in the oven like that, it would have scorched edges. So what we tend to do is, and I'm putting the shiny side out so it will reflect the heat away, and I'm making a little border to protect the crust. Now for the last 15 minutes of the baking time, you take that off, and then you can let your edge of your crust brown to a nice golden, but not be burnt. Okay, we're going to get this in the oven and let it bake for 40 to 50 minutes. In 40 minutes I'll check to see whether it's done, but first I have to remember to set my timer to take this foil off. Well, while we're waiting for the pie to get done, I'll talk a little bit about the collaboration. Now, the collaboration was started by 3 ladies. Tammy from Little Jordan Farm, Lori from Whippoorwill Holler, and Vicki from Vicky's Country Home. Anyway, these 3 ladies got together and decided to do this collaboration, and we are supposed to, as collaborators, tag somebody or challenge somebody to do a pie And the two people that I'm going to challenge are Brenda from Mainiac, Grammie's Homestead. She lives up in Maine, and they've got a lot of pretty leaves going on right now because fall is there with all the maple trees that they have. And one of these days I want to go to Maine and see the fall colors. I mean, that's on my bucket list. And the other one I am challenging is Heidi from Rain Country. She lives in the Pacific Northwest. She has a very active channel that where she does a lot of stuff in her kitchen, and so I think both of these ladies will make a good pie and a good video for a pie. Well, I baked the pie 5 minutes more than the maximum because I kind of wanted to see it bubbling up out of the top, and I can see down in there that it is boiling inside there, but usually I like to leave a pie in until it starts bubbling up through the slits. That pie is really thick. Oh, I don't know. And then I put the rest of the apples in this dish to bake. And then while my oven's hot, I decided to stick some cornbread in there for our lunch. A nice hot pie is always appealing, but I know from previous experience that it's not a good idea to cut a hot pie because it just kind of falls apart. It's better to let it cool. So I'll let it cool, and then we'll let old guy have a taste, and I'll probably get a taste too. I think the pie's cool enough to cut. It's still a little bit warm, but that's okay. It's probably thickened enough. I think that looks pretty nice. We like to eat our pie out of a bowl with heavy cream poured over it. Ice cream is nice too, but the heavy cream we think is better.
This apple pie really smells good and looks good, so I'll bet it is good. And I think we should have some kind of a contest or something every week so we could all enjoy pie.
You think you'd like one fresh apple pie a week, or any kind of pie?
Most any kind of pie.
I don't make that many pies, do I? Problem is, I like to eat them.
Well, I'm going downtown with my hat caved in.
Don't take too long, they'll think you don't like it.
Pocket full of tin.
But really, you shouldn't be eating any of this. I better eat it all so you don't have to.
Oh.
Tickled too.
I'm gonna go eat one right now, like, I can't wait.
It's very good and you'll enjoy it.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to check out the other people in the collaboration and the people I've tagged who are also in the collaboration. Bye for now.
Bye now.